The courtroom was tense, filled with the weight of unspoken truths. The air smelled of polished wood and legal paperwork, the quiet hum of whispers barely breaking through the heavy silence. The defendant, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, sat rigidly in his chair, his hands clenched together. Across the room, his young daughter sat on the witness stand, her small fingers gripping the edge of the seat. No one expected her to say much. The lawyers had prepared for a routine testimony, carefully worded questions with predictable answers. But then, in a voice both fragile and resolute, she suddenly spoke, words that sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom. The judge's gavel struck the desk. The decision was swift. The father was guilty. Gasps filled the courtroom. The little girl's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with meaning, impossible to ignore. The prosecutor's pen froze mid-sentence. The defense attorney shifted uneasily in his seat. The father's face drained of color. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Would you repeat that, sweetheart?" His voice was gentle but firm. The girl swallowed hard. Her small hands trembled in her lap, but she lifted her chin. "I saw him do it," she whispered. "I saw everything." A sob broke from the mother's lips. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances. The father, who had maintained a composed silence throughout the trial, suddenly lurched forward. "She's lying," he shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. The bailiff moved in quickly, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. The girl flinched at the outburst, but she didn't take back her words. She stared straight ahead, her eyes filled with something far too heavy for a child to carry. The judge exhaled, slow and deliberate. He turned to the jury, whose faces mirrored the weight of the moment. The truth had been spoken, and there was no turning back. The courtroom, once so orderly and controlled, now felt like it had cracked open, spilling raw emotion onto the polished floor. And at the center of it all sat a little girl, too young to understand the full weight of justice, but old enough to know what she had seen. A hush fell over the courtroom, thick with unspoken tension. The girl's words lingered in the air, irreversible. The father's breathing had turned ragged, his fingers twitching against the table as if grasping for something. An explanation, a denial, an escape. The judge glanced toward the prosecutor, who sat frozen for a moment before standing. "Your Honor," she said, her voice measured but charged. "In light of this testimony, the prosecution requests a recess to confer with the witness." The defense attorney shot up from his seat. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular. She's just a child. We need clarification." His voice wavered, betraying the strain beneath his controlled demeanor. The judge held up a hand, silencing both attorneys. His gaze returned to the girl, whose small frame seemed even smaller under the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. "Miss Carter," he addressed her gently, using her name for the first time, "I need to ask you a very important question." The girl nodded, her lips pressed together, her feet barely touching the ground from the tall witness chair. "Are you sure about what you saw?" His tone was careful, not pressing, not leading, just seeking. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Yes." Her mother broke down, clutching a tissue to her face, her sobs muffled but raw. The father clenched his jaw, his expression darkening, the veins in his neck taut. "She's confused," he murmured, shaking his head. "She's been manipulated." The bailiff moved closer. The judge took a long breath, tapping his gavel lightly, a signal not of finality, but of control. "Very well," he said. "We'll take a short recess." The gavel struck. The tension cracked, but it didn't dissipate. The courtroom stirred as people shuffled to their feet, whispering, glancing at one another with a mix of shock and curiosity. The defense attorney leaned in toward his client, whispering furiously. The prosecutor gathered her notes, her expression unreadable. But the little girl just sat there, staring at the polished wood of the witness stand, her hands now gripping the seat so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had spoken the truth. And yet, deep down, she knew this wasn't over. The little girl, Emily Carter, remained in her seat even as the courtroom emptied. Her small hands clutched the edge of the witness stand, her legs swinging slightly, not out of playfulness but out of nervous energy she didn't know how to contain. Her mother, Sarah, approached her, eyes red-rimmed and damp. She knelt beside her daughter, brushing strands of light brown hair from the girl's face. "You did the right thing," she whispered, though her voice wavered as if she was trying to convince herself as much as Emily. Emily didn't answer. Her throat felt tight. Across the room, her father, Daniel Carter, sat stiffly with his lawyer, his head bowed, his hands interlaced on the table. He didn't look at her. He didn't say her name. That, more than anything, made her stomach twist. As people filed out of the courtroom, the prosecutor, Melissa Grant, approached Sarah and Emily. She crouched down, her professional tone softening. "Emily," she said gently, "can we talk for a moment?" Sarah glanced at her daughter, who nodded hesitantly. They were led into a small side room, away from the eyes and murmurs of the courtroom. It was quieter here, but the weight in Emily's chest remained. Melissa sat across from her, setting her notepad aside. "I know this is hard," she began. "You were very brave up there." Emily stared at her hands. "Is Daddy going to jail?" The question hung in the air. Melissa exhaled. "That's up to the court to decide," she said carefully. "But what you said today was very important." Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand. "Emily," she murmured, "can you tell Ms. Grant everything? From the beginning?" The girl swallowed. For a long moment, she was silent. Then her lips parted, and the words, soft and trembling, began to spill out. "I didn't want to believe it," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought maybe I was wrong, that I saw it wrong." She hesitated, looking up at Melissa with wide, pleading eyes. "But I didn't, did I?" Melissa shook her head. "No, sweetheart, you didn't." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she clenched her small fists. "He said he didn't do it," she said. "He told me to forget. He told me if I loved him, I wouldn't say anything." Sarah inhaled sharply, her grip on Emily tightening. Melissa's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes darkened. "Emily," she said, her voice steady but gentle, "you are not responsible for protecting him. That's not your job." Emily sniffled, staring at the floor. "But he's my dad." "I know," Melissa said, "and that makes this harder. But telling the truth doesn't mean you don't love him. She paused, letting that sink in. It just means you know right from wrong. For a moment, Emily didn't say anything. Then slowly she nodded. Sarah pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her tightly, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. Outside, beyond the closed doors of the small room, the courtroom remained. The trial was still unfinished. The verdict had not yet been given. But in that quiet space, in that single moment, something had shifted. Emily had spoken her truth. And for the first time since it all began, she no longer felt afraid. The courtroom resumed after the short recess. Emily sat beside her mother at the prosecution's table, her small fingers intertwined with Sarah's trembling hands. Across the room, her father sat motionless, his expression unreadable. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he didn't respond. He just stared at the wooden surface of the table, as if avoiding everyone's eyes, including Emily's. The judge tapped his gavel, signaling for silence. Court is now back in session. His voice was steady, but the weight of what had just happened lingered heavily in the room. Melissa Grant stood up, smoothing her suit jacket. She turned toward the jury, her gaze unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "what we witnessed before the recess was not just a testimony. It was a moment of truth. A child, who should never have been burdened with such a terrible secret, found the courage to speak up." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The defense may argue that she is confused, that her memory is flawed. But let me ask you this. What reason would a little girl have to lie about something so painful?" The defense attorney, Mark Donovan, slowly rose from his chair. His voice was calm but edged with urgency. "Your Honor, while we sympathize with the emotional weight of this case, we must remember that memory, especially that of a child, is unreliable. My client insists that he is innocent, and we have yet to examine the full context of this accusation." He turned to Emily, his gaze softer than before. "Emily," he said carefully, "I know this is difficult, but I have to ask you something. When you say you saw everything, can you tell us exactly what you mean?" Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel her mother's reassuring presence beside her, but it didn't stop the cold fear creeping up her spine. She licked her lips, trying to steady her voice. "I woke up that night," she began, her voice small but clear. "I heard something, like someone crying. I got out of bed and went to the top of the stairs." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. "That's when I saw him, Daddy. He was standing there, and..." Her breath hitched. Mark Donovan's eyes were locked on hers, searching, waiting. "And what, Emily?" he asked gently. Emily squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, as if trying to block out the image. But it was there, burned into her memory. "And he was hurting her," she whispered. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. The judge struck his gavel. "Order in the court." Mark inhaled deeply, choosing his next words carefully. "Emily," he said, "are you absolutely sure it was your father?" Emily's lip quivered, but she didn't look away. "I saw his face," she said. "I heard his voice." Sarah let out a quiet sob, covering her mouth with her hand. Across the room, Daniel Carter finally moved. He looked up at his daughter, something breaking in his eyes. something raw and exposed. And then, for the first time since the trial began, he spoke. Emily. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Emily's breath caught. He was looking at her now, not with anger, not with denial, but with something that made her chest ache. Guilt. Melissa Grant turned sharply to face him. Mr. Carter, do you have something to say? His lawyer reached for his arm, whispering urgently, but Daniel didn't seem to hear him. He was still staring at Emily. For a long, unbearable moment, the courtroom waited. Then, slowly, Daniel exhaled, lowering his head. I'm sorry, he murmured. The room fell into stunned silence. Melissa straightened, her expression unreadable. Are you admitting to the charges, Mr. Carter? Daniel didn't answer immediately. He closed his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but resolute. I never wanted her to see, he said. I never wanted her to know. A sharp gasp cut through the silence. Sarah's shoulders shook, tears streaming down her face. Emily just sat there, frozen, the words ringing in her ears. The man who had once lifted her onto his shoulders, who had tucked her in at night, who had told her stories before bed, was now the man admitting to something she had desperately wished wasn't true. The judge looked at Daniel Carter, his gaze heavy. Mr. Carter, he said, are you officially confessing to the charges against you? Daniel didn't look up, but he nodded. A verdict had not yet been given. The trial was still ongoing. But in that moment, the truth, undeniable, irreversible, had been spoken. And Emily Carter, just a little girl, had changed everything. The courtroom was silent. No more objections, no more arguments. Just the weight of a father's confession settling over everyone like a heavy fog. Emily's breath came in shallow waves. She had imagined this moment so many times, wondering if she would be believed, if her voice would matter. And now, as her father sat there, head bowed, hands trembling, she wasn't sure how to feel. Relief? Sadness? Maybe both. The judge exhaled, his expression grim. Given the defendant's confession, the court will proceed with sentencing. He glanced at the prosecutor. Ms. Grant, we will reconvene in 2 weeks for final deliberation. Melissa Grant nodded. Understood, Your Honor. The judge's gavel struck one final time. Court is adjourned. A wave of movement followed. Whispers, murmurs, reporters scribbling notes. The bailiffs approached Daniel Carter, securing handcuffs around his wrists. He didn't resist. He didn't fight. He just turned, looking at Emily one last time. She met his gaze, and for a fleeting second, he looked like the father she once knew. The one who carried her on his shoulders, who tucked her in at night, who promised to always keep her safe. I'm sorry, Emmy, he whispered. Her chest tightened. For everything he had done, for the pain he had caused, a part of her still wished things had been different. But she didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mother pulled her into a tight embrace, shielding her from the chaos around them. It's over, baby, Sarah murmured into her hair. It's finally over. But Emily wasn't sure if it really was. Because even as her father was led away, even as the courtroom emptied and the world outside continued as if nothing had changed, she knew the scars would remain. Truth had won. Justice had been served. But childhood, once lost, could never be returned. And so, as she stepped out of the courtroom into the bright afternoon light, she squeezed her mother's hand and took a deep breath, ready to start over, to heal, to move forward, one step at a time.